Säkon kun waratus. Kitsagos na yujats tanu ganyatu. Tanu ganya kahaga gaya to the kana sataga ganakane tanu ahanto kataswa wakat hunzoni ti tin waratus na sungoyati tu tioya sawani sarata runis. Tioya sawani sarata wanti in ganakane na kana yeti ista hunzate. Tinagwa gano hota runis. Tanu honin ti tin waratus na yeti ista hunzate. Agwe kun hota yung kiawis. Agwe kun hota yakoyote. Agwe kun tun hatsara yung kiawis. Ni tinawaratus na gwe ko da wana roni. Ti yahtawantu kira gwe ko unkane. Da wana re. Na wara hache ti ukata hunzoni tioni ti ukatsanuni ti tika iges ni namaskuyam rauhutsa. Tio yanaragi sa winisarate, tanu tio wesa ti oya sa winisarate yung guanagere. So I want to thank you and introduce you in my language. My name is Gatsitsakwas, which means picking up flowers. I'm from the Turtle Clan, and as Bev said, from the community of Ganisadage. I want to acknowledge the people on whose land this is taking place, the Musqueam Nation. And I wanted to thank the creators before I start. Usually in our custom, we start with acknowledging all our relations. So I wanted to acknowledge all our relations, even though I could not name them all. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, especially considering the kind of day you all had yesterday with those wonderful men. It's always inspiring, and I often get asked after presenting, because people think I'm so cynical, if there is hope. And I saw hope yesterday in those men. And the way that they presented themselves is the way men should be presenting themselves. But I want to go deeper into what they discussed yesterday. Because Indigenous people have always felt like we are on the outside looking in. We have always felt homeless within our own homelands. And we have always felt like we are the other. We are put into categories with immigrants and minorities, but we do not have the same history as immigrants and minorities. We are peoples with self-determining rights. We are peoples with a history of this continent. We are peoples with our own languages, our own territories, our own system of governance, and our own ways of doing things. And I want you to think of the work that you are doing, for those of you who are working with Indigenous women, to think of it not as just a domestic issue, because it's not. It's a violation of human rights. And I want to talk about how a human rights framework can help you in the work that you're doing. Rudolfo Stavenhagen, who was the first United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, said the specific needs of Aboriginal peoples have been neglected for far too long. Bev and I have worked tirelessly at the international level, as with others, leaders from our communities, to talk about the rights of Indigenous peoples, that we have a right to self-determination. And while Canada's history books say that we are conquered people, we know that that's not the truth. We know that your children and you have been taught lies by your government and by educational institutions, and that your education institutions have not only failed Indigenous children, but they have failed your children as well. Because it's a lie, and lies are propaganda. And we should not tolerate or accept it, as the general from the Australian general said yesterday. The standards that you want to uphold are the standards you will live by. And so breaking the silence on the injustices of Aboriginal people must be done by people like you. I have been doing this for 23 years. And each time I speak to people, I see hope. And perhaps, when we look at the Indian residential school system, which was an act of genocide, not just cultural genocide, it's more palpable for people to understand, but genocide. Forcible removal of children, against an identifiable group of people, stripping us of our languages, our identity, our sexuality, our spirituality, and our very identity, our essence, our languages. We have been taught by our elders that we are to take care of the land and those who cannot speak for themselves. And we talk about those relatives. When we say all our relations, we talk about the four-legged ones. For us, the four-legged leader is the deer. We talk about the medicines because they keep us healthy. We talk about Junhekwa, the sustainers of life, the corn, beans, and the squash, which nutritionists within the last decade discovered, the Iroquois people, they were smart. Because when you combine those three together, they make a complete protein. And so we call them our sustainers of life. And I can talk about the statistics about Aboriginal women are 5 times more likely to die as a result of violence. That our families, we are 4 times more likely to be living in crowded housing, if any housing. 3 times more likely to be living in homes with repairs that need desperate repairs and moldy. And what has happened, especially with this government, but I won't just blame Stephen Harper, I will blame all the previous prime ministers of Canada. They have politicized and commodified our rights. From the doctrine of discovery, papal bulls, and terra nullius, where the indigenous peoples of this land were not considered human beings, the leaders of colonial empires still look at us today as taxpayers' burdens. And that's not true. In 1886, a trust fund was created for Indigenous peoples, for our health care, our housing, our education, from the royalties taken, from resources taken from our lands and resources. So none of your tax-paying dollars goes to pay for our services. And it is this very kind of relationship as wards of the state within the Indian Act that has caused us to be the most of every single statistic that you can look at in Canada. But I want to talk about another statistic to me, which makes me proud. That 2/3 or 3/4 of the Indigenous peoples in Canada who are going to post-secondary education are women. And I remember John Montour, who was a band council chief in Ganawag, and I was at one of the AFN-QL meeting, Quebec and Labrador meetings, and he said, nothing gets done in our communities without the work of the women. No man here can claim that he's accomplished anything without knowing that it's on the backs and the heart and the blood and the sweat of the women. And so this relationship that we have with Canada is broken. The Royal Commission has talked numerous times about how broken it is. 5 volumes, is it 5 volumes of a report that sits in the National Archives in Canada. And the human rights, if we talk about human rights, here's what human rights means, that they're universal. They belong to everyone. They're interdependent. They are interconnected, meaning that if one human right is violated, then it impacts the rest of that person and individual's human rights. And they're inalienable. They're inherent to each person and cannot be taken away. But in Canada, they have been taken away for centuries. Because we're going on, Canada in 1967 celebrated its 100th anniversary. I was 8 years old then. And I didn't know much about my own history back then. But I look at the way we are today. We have one of the most wonderful accomplishments at the international level, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. a major accomplishment, 20 years in the making, with the full participation of Indigenous peoples throughout the world. And the government of Canada, this particular government of Canada, said, there's no legal obligation to this. This is just a declaration. It's aspirational. Well, what about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? That was made right after the war, when we had a tyrant. The whole world had a tyrant attacking a particular group of people, committing genocide. And so they came up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to make sure that this does not happen again. And there's wonderful people that worked on it. And I heard it said from a top UN official that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was made, they forgot to think about the Indigenous peoples. But today you are here to think about us, to see us as your equals, to see us as your brothers and sisters. And I'm here to assimilate you today with what I'm going to talk about. Assimilate you because our very identity is linked to the land. Our very identity is who we are with the land, our languages, and it's often been said, especially by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, it said unless a child learns about the forces which shape him, the history of their people, their values and customs and their language, that child will never really know himself or their potential as a human being.